Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Susie Gelman, and I'm privileged to serve as the board chair of Israel Policy Forum. If you're joining Israel Policy Forum for the first time today, I want to welcome you. And if you are a returning viewer, let me welcome you back. For those who are new to us, Israel Policy Forum works to educate policymakers, Jewish community leaders, and leaders of the next generation to be informed and effective in their support of US efforts to advance a viable two-state outcome to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict consistent with Israel's security. In this critical moment, we are pleased to continue with our regular Tuesday video briefings. The impending arrival of a new administration in Washington presents important opportunities for our efforts to ensure a Jewish, democratic, and secure future for the state of Israel and a robust US-Israel relationship. To stay informed about our work and our upcoming programs, I encourage you to visit our website at www.israelpolicyforum.org to become an email subscriber. On our website, I also invite you to check out our policy director, Michael Koplow's weekly column and information on how young professionals can get involved through our IPF ATID program. I also encourage you to tune into our podcast, Israel Policy Pod. To keep all of our work going, we rely on your generosity. So to all of our supporters on this program, I want to take this opportunity to say thank you. If you view Israel Policy Forum as a vital resource, want to help ensure the success of our initiatives in the year ahead, and have not already done so, then I encourage you to make a contribution today, Giving Tuesday, at www.israelpolicyforum.org/giving. Now, on to today's program. The Trump administration remains in office for just under 2 months. In that time, the current president and other outgoing officials can still effect significant change on issues related to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the wider Middle East. Indeed, we've already seen new policies implemented in the lame duck period on the subject of West Bank settlement product labeling and Iran. Israel has also taken a number of steps to change the situation on the ground in sensitive areas in Jerusalem and the West Bank. To help us better understand what to watch before President-elect Joe Biden assumes office in January, we are joined by two of Israel Policy Forum's policy advisors, Dr. Shaul Arieli and Ilan Goldenberg. In the first portion of the program, Shaul will examine the recently announced plans in the Givat Hamatos area of East Jerusalem and other potential plans in the weeks ahead, using Israel Policy Forum's brand new virtual platform, a digital resource currently in beta testing. In the second portion of the program, Ilan will give us some insight into the regional picture. And then, as always, we will go to audience questions. Before we begin, a few reminders. We encourage you to ask questions of our speakers, which we will address in the latter half of today's program. To submit a question, please type it out in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Next, a recording of this program will be posted to our website, www.israelpolicyforum.org, as part of an episode of our Israel Policy podcast later on today. With that, Shaul, Ilan, thank you both for joining us. Shaul, let me start with you. One of the issues of concern over the coming 60 days is a surge in settlement activity in East Jerusalem and in the West Bank. Recently, there was an announcement that bidding could begin on a project to build more than 1,200 housing units in the controversial Givat Hamatos area, which would constitute the first new Jewish neighborhood to be built in East Jerusalem in 2 decades. In response, the European Union expressed deep concerns, and Mahmoud Abbas called it an attempt to kill the two-state solution. Advancing such a step, just as the Biden administration takes office, could be viewed as a last-ditch effort to create new facts on the ground that make a future two-state solution harder to realize. So Shaul, and I want to enable Shaul to utilize our new virtual tool to walk us through this issue. Shaul, why are the plans for Givat Hamatos so controversial? Where are we in the planning process, and what are the implications of these plans? And what else might be in the works?
Okay, thank you, Susie. First of all, I will share the screen with the with the virtual tour. Okay, this one. I chose to show this in 2 points. The first one is, of course, Givat HaMatos, and also Ilan in Ma'ale Adumim, which were both were defined by the EU as a red lines, and also the US administration, I'm talking about Obama administration, stand behind this position. I would not be right to talk about these moves without knowing the Israeli master plans behind it and their development since 1967. In principle, these plans involves expanding the Israeli hold on the mountain ridge between Jenin via Jerusalem until Hebron and destroying the Palestinian contiguity in it. This is done by expanding the city of Jerusalem, creating urban buffer zones, Jewish urban buffer zone between the centers of the Palestinian population, cutting off the Palestinian roads system and building an alternative to the Israeli traffic only. And I would like to start here with Mount Scopus. From this lookout, we can see the old city of Jerusalem here with the Temple Mount. And just to tell you what was West Jerusalem, you can see the green line. This is West Jerusalem, the capital of Israel until 67. And then we have El-Quds, East Jerusalem, that used to be under the Jordanian control for 19 years. This area, the brown area, very small area, 6 square kilometers. And as you know, after 67 war, the Israeli government, headed by Levi Eshkol, decided to enlarge Jerusalem. And here we can see the purple line, which is the Jerusalem boundaries for today's from Ramallah in the north via El-Quds until Bethlehem in the south. It's about 70 square kilometers. And then the Israeli government launched a master plan for Jewish construction. First of all, the first challenge was to bridge the gap between West Jerusalem to Mount Scopus, and for this we build the Israeli neighborhood. You can see here we call them the Lock neighborhood from West Jerusalem to Mount Scopus. And then the second stage in this master plan was in we call it the Rink neighborhood, and I'm talking about we move to our next lookout, which is in Nebi Samuel area. Again, from here we can see West Jerusalem, the green line, and Jerusalem boundaries here. Okay, and then here we can see how the Israeli government decided to build the Jewish neighborhoods, to build this buffer zone from the west to the east to separate on the mountain ridge Ramallah. You see here, this is Ramallah, area A, to separate Ramallah from the rest of Jerusalem by building this buffer zone. And from here, we can see what we did in the southern part of Jerusalem. And I'm moving now to Ramat Rachel. This is Ramat Rachel, the hotel and the kibbutz. You see here the green line, again, West Jerusalem, around Ramat Rachel. And on the other side, we can see Bethlehem area and the Jerusalem boundaries, the purple line. Israel annexed all this area to Jerusalem, and to build the buffer zone between Bethlehem, this area, to Jerusalem, Israel start building the Jewish neighborhood in the southern part of Jerusalem. First of all, we can see here Har Gilo neighborhood, and also Israel changed the main access route. Instead of this route number 60 from Jerusalem to Bethlehem, Israel built a new road 60 via the Israeli area. And then in 1997, during his first term in office, Netanyahu decided to begin construction of Har Homa neighborhood, which Rabin avoided establishing. The neighborhood added a part to the creation of the Jewish urban buffer between Bethlehem to Jerusalem. This is what we can see from here. This is Har Homa. Today we have more than 30,000 people who are living in Har Homa, and you see how this neighborhood really separate between Bethlehem to East Jerusalem. This is the Palestinian neighborhoods in East Jerusalem, and the access road for this before 67 from Bethlehem was this road to Tzur Bacher. So here now in 2020, we have the gap between Gilo neighborhood to Har Homa and the kibbutz Ramat Rachel. And Netanyahu again in this year decided to build Givat Amatos neighborhood, this one. You see the yellow area. Part, by the way, the yellow area, part of this is inside the green line, but you can see how this neighborhood joined to the others and bridged the gap between Gilo neighborhood and Kibbutz Ramat Rachel via Har Homa neighborhood to complete the Jewish buffer zone to separate Bethlehem from Jerusalem. Here, now we are the master plan for this neighborhood. It's about 2,600 new housing units, and today the first stage deals with 1,200 new housing units here, but this is only part of the plan, because according to the master plan, Israel is going to build here a huge tourism compound along road number 60. We call it Hebron Way. And by doing this, as I said, we are completing the Jewish urban buffer zone separating Bethlehem from East Jerusalem.
Shaul, can I interrupt you for a second? Shaul, do you have a way of putting up the two-dimensional map for a second, just so people can see a different way of looking at this? Remember the maps that you've shown us? I don't know. I think just if you could put up for a sec, just so people can see exactly what we're looking at. And then you can also remind people with the map how Givat Amatos, and we haven't even gotten to Har Homa yet, will cut off the contiguity between Bethlehem and Ramallah and Jerusalem.
Bethlehem and Jerusalem, again, this is our location here in Ramat Rachel, and we are looking south to Bethlehem. You see here Bethlehem, and behind Bethlehem, this is Etzion, Efrat, Etzion block, and we are looking inside the area that was annexed to Israel after 67 war. So we are standing now on the green line, and in front of us, the purple line, this is the Jerusalem boundaries since 67, the annexation of the 70 square kilometers to Jerusalem. So this buffer zone, the southern buffer zone, includes Gilo neighborhood, Har Choma on the other side. In the center, we have Kibbutz Ramat Rachel, and to bridge the gap between them, we need to build here Givat Amatos and the rest of this plan by building the tourism compound along road number 60. Why it's so important? It's so important because according to President Clinton parameters about the Jerusalem, to divide East Jerusalem according to the demographic line, we can see here what was the Israeli proposal. As you can see here in this map, this area, all this area planned to be part of Israel, including Givat Amatos, but Olmert and Barak, or even Sharon, avoid to build this neighborhood. And for the Palestinians, as you know, the Palestinians agreed that Israel will annex all the Jewish neighborhoods in East Jerusalem, but they refuse to let Israel annex Har Choma. Why? Because as you can see very clear in this view, how Har Choma separating Bet Sachur and Bet Lechem area from East Jerusalem. And now about Givat Amatos, it's not only part of this buffer zone. Also, the Palestinians insist during Annapolis process that this Palestinian village, Bet Safafa, that was annexed to Israel in '67, will be part of the Palestinian capital, according to the proposal that Clinton came out in December 2000. It must be part of the Palestinian capital. So by building Givat Amatos neighborhood together with the tourism compound, it means that it will be as an enclave inside the Israeli area, and Givat Amatos will cut the Palestinian contiguity from Bethlehem to Bet Safafa. So these are the two main implications of Givat Amatos and Har Choma. By the way, today we know that we can keep Har Choma under the Israeli control, but by giving the Palestinians this access road to connect them, to East Jerusalem. But by building Givat Amatos and the tourism compound, it means that this option doesn't exist anymore. So we have for Givat Amatos, we have three alternatives to the leaders who are interested to resume the negotiation between Israel and the PLO according to Clinton parameter and the Annapolis parameter. The first one, the unlikely in the foreseeable future, that under certain conditions, Israel will give up these neighborhoods in favor of the Palestinians. This is additional billions shekel that went down the drain, and tens of thousands of Israelis who will be required to relocate to Israel. I'm talking about Givat Har Choma with more than 30,000 people, and Givat Amatos, it will be about 10,000 people. The second option, which is more likely, is that for significant changes in other areas like security, refugee, the Palestinians will accept Israel's position and give up these neighborhoods and Bet Safafa, and they will be required to build an expensive and complex road network that will connect Bethlehem to East Jerusalem east of Har Choma. I'm talking about building a new road system here between Bethlehem to to East Jerusalem to bypass Har Homa area. And the third option, most likely, in my opinion, is that this step will join other steps that Israel has taken in recent years to abolish the physical separation that still exists between the Jewish and the Arab neighborhoods in East Jerusalem, and force Israel to accept the Palestinian alternative into one city with two municipalities. As a result, historical experience shows that it will become the seed of the next catastrophe between the parties due the security, economic, and social aspects required to this pattern of the city, of the management of this city. So this is really a huge, this step has a huge impact on the feasibility of two-state solution. So the second issue, it will be very short. It's about Ma'ale Adumim, about E1. Again, this is Ma'ale Adumim, as you can see here. And on the mountain ridge, we can see Jerusalem and the Jerusalem boundaries since 67. And the main important interest of the Israeli side, it's about route number one, the yellow route, this one, which connects Jerusalem via Ma'ale Adumim to the Jordan Valley, to the what used to be the eastern security zone of Israel. And to protect and to control this road, Israel decided, of course, to build settlements. And here we can see on one side, Ma'ale Adumim, which totally controls the road number one. On the other side, we have small Israeli settlement, like this one, Kfar Adumim, but also a huge military base like this one here on the other side. So, and to complete this plan, we are dealing with E1. This is E1, you see. The idea is to bridge the gap between Ma'ale Adumim area to Jerusalem via Mount Scopus. And the plan is here is to build a new neighborhood, very large neighborhood with 4,000 new housing units. But in meantime, Israel only prepared the infrastructure for this neighborhood by investing hundreds of millions of shekel to build, as you can see here, the headquarters of the police district here, this one, and also the roads, and even interchanges here and here to connect Ma'ale Adumim to E1. We call it in Hebrew Mevaseret Adumim, to have this huge city to block East Jerusalem from the east side. It means we are blocking. I'm finished.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, yes, we are blocking by doing this. You see, we are blocking any future development of East Jerusalem, and also separating the northern part of the West Bank from the southern part of the West Bank.
I'm sure we will want to follow with some questions for you, Shaul, and also talk about particularly the timing issues with regard to Givat Matos and Har Homa expansion. But let me turn to Ilan, and then we'll have some questions for both of you. And then, of course, the audience will, our audience will certainly have some questions. So, Ilan, as we know, settlement activity and potential development, as Shaul just laid out, of new settlements or new expansions of settlements is not the only concern in the days before Donald Trump leaves office. Last week, Mike Pompeo visited West Bank settlements an unprecedented act for a sitting Secretary of State. And he also issued a new policy directive mandating products originating in Area C of the West Bank to be labeled, quote, product of Israel, regardless of whether they're produced by Jewish settlers or Palestinians. What implications do you think all these actions have for US policy going forward? Is this implicit American recognition of annexation, Ilan?
Yeah, and I mean, I think, well, thanks, Susie, first of all, for having me, and great to be with all of you on this call. And that was really interesting from Shaul. I'm looking forward to seeing more of this cool graphics and interactive that he's got going on. It's, unfortunately in this day and age, we can't actually travel much, but at least we can do this, and hopefully we'll all be able to travel again soon. So look, on Pompeo's visit, I mean, deeply disturbing in many ways, starting with the fact that, as you said, visited a settlement, Psagot, for the first time ever by a Secretary of State, changed the labeling. By the way, the guidance on labeling to anything that is produced in Area C of the West Bank being from Israel. So Palestinians who have olive farms on Area C, now that's product being produced by Israel. I mean, it really is just one step away from kind of implicitly kind of recognizing annexation and saying all of Area C is Israel. It's not quite there, but it's getting pretty close. And it's also just the latest in kind of a hit parade. A couple of weeks ago, we had a scientific agreement that for the first time opened up. This is a bilateral agreement between the US and Israel. In the past, we've had a lot of economic cooperation and scientific cooperation, but specifically American money was kept out of the settlements. David Friedman recently signed a new deal with the Israelis that will now have money going into the settlements directly, for scientific cooperation, which I think is pretty unhealthy and also really mixes something that's really great about the US-Israel relationship, like bilateral technology cooperation, with something that's like much more problematic in terms of the support for the settlements. And of course you've got Givat Matos, and who knows what else you have coming in the last 60 days. I think there's kind of this combination of, Mike Pompeo trying to set his, 2024 run by doing everything he can to embrace, sort of the far right wing Israeli perspective on things that appeals to parts of his evangelical base. And then you have David Friedman, who's more coming at it from a policy perspective. The ambassador just wants to do as much as he can and make it as irreversible as possible. The good news on the settlement stuff in particular, not the construction, that could be deeply, deeply, deeply problematic, but on some of the steps Pompeo took, such as Psagot, like that basically just requires a reversal of an American legal finding that was made a couple years ago by the State Department, where traditionally, the US position has been that settlements are inconsistent with international law. Secretary Pompeo a couple of years changed that position. Actually, I think it was maybe just actually a year ago. It was sort of end of 2019. That's something that can be done very early, I think, by a new administration to just change the legal ruling back to what it was, and make clear that the US, does not recognize the settlements as part of Israel, and change the labeling policy back to what it was. So it's completely clear that products that are made inside the West Bank are considered made in the West Bank, not in Israel. So, I think what the Trump administration is doing right now, both it's a combination of political just benefits and ideological reasons, and partially just to make life as hard as possible for the Biden folks coming in, is just throw as many things at the wall. I mean, I think that this is true on a whole series of issues that span far beyond just the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But I think Secretary Pompeo's visit was just another part, and all the steps taken in advance of it was, let's make it so that they have to spend so much time on doing all the crazy stuff we did that they don't have enough time to do new things or actually drive their own agenda. So I think that's what they're trying to do. I don't think it'll work, but yeah, every one of these things creates a new headache a Biden administration has to undo.
Thanks, Ilan. So I want to turn for a moment to Iran. Earlier this month, we learned that Iran's enriched uranium stockpile was 12 times what was permitted under the JCPOA nuclear deal. Let's unpack this development. Can you put this amount in perspective with regard to what is needed to assemble a nuclear warhead?
So I mean, if you look at it this way, like Iran now has enough low enriched uranium again to make, I think, a couple of nuclear weapons. If it were to take that material and develop it all the way to a bomb, which it still would take it probably about 6 months to a year, and would also involve having to do a bunch of other things to make a nuclear weapon that would be pretty easily detectable and that would cause them to get in a lot of trouble and potentially get struck militarily before they ever got there, which is one of the reasons like they don't do that. They've been kind of on this pathway for 20 years of inching forward, stopping, inching forward, or in the case of the JCPOA, after we cut the nuclear agreement, putting them far enough back and then having all the checks in place through inspections and other things to actually keep them from moving forward, right? And so this is the problem. We had, a nuclear agreement that was working, that was deterring Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. The Trump administration decided to walk away from that agreement unilaterally, reimpose all these sanctions, which have imposed a lot of pain on Iran for sure, but haven't gotten Iran to change its behavior in the same way that the nuclear agreement did, and it actually gotten Iran to go in the opposite direction. So, now we have, Vice President, or I guess President-elect Biden, we can say that instead, has committed publicly that he wants to return to the JCPOA. He wants to return to the nuclear agreement. He wants the US and Iran to come back into compliance. But he only sees that as a first step. After that, there's talk of like, what does a follow-on nuclear agreement look like to make sure that some of the sort of shortcomings in the first agreement, especially concerns over after a period of time, you have certain sunset provisions where certain restrictions come off of Iran. You can extend those in exchange for giving Iran more, for example, sanctions relief. You can also look at a broader regional dialogue to try to de-escalate and tackle some of the other challenges that present in the region, whether that's Iran-Saudi competition, Iranian actions in Syria or Lebanon, and other areas where we disagree. I don't think we're going to solve all these problems overnight, but I think that smart diplomacy can lead to some serious de-escalation. For the number of years after the JCPOA was signed, before Trump pulled out, there were no attacks on American troops in Iraq. There were no mines going off in the Gulf, like taking out ships. There was no missiles being fired at Saudi Arabia. And after the withdrawal, we've started to see increasingly this escalation and this challenge. So for the next few months, I do expect Trump administration is going to throw as many sanctions as they can into to try to gum things up and make it as hard for the Biden folks as possible to go back to the nuclear agreement. I don't think that will work. I do remain frankly concerned, and if folks saw, there was a news article about a week ago that the New York Times reported that the president wanted to strike Iran and that his advisors talked him out of it. I don't think we're out of the woods there yet. We still have 60 days. I don't, look, if you had to ask me, like, I don't think it's going to happen. There's a lot of reasons why it won't happen. It's kind of crazy to do this. Like politically, it's not necessarily a winner for Trump with his base. There's a lot of, his advisors will try to talk him out of it, but we have 60 days. We've seen some very strange things in recent weeks, the changeover of the entire senior leadership of the Department of Defense, like air exercises into the Middle East, flights of like long range bombers from the United States into the Middle East that were kind of disturbing. Sort of unusual levels of consultations with Israel and Saudi Arabia beyond the usual, especially at the military level. So you see all these and a couple of other indicators, and we have the anniversary coming up of, the killing of Qasem Soleimani, which could be a real moment of tension in early January. So you put all, and by the way, like, let's just remember, if you think, nah, this is totally crazy, it can't happen. I mean, nobody thought that the US would kill Qasem Soleimani and that we'd almost go to war about a year ago, I mean, that's how 2020 started. Before COVID, before all the other craziness that came, like the first thing that came and dominated the news the first week was the near Iran-US war. We're fortunate that didn't happen. But if, Trump administration, for example, decides to go after the nuclear program in the last couple of months to make sure there's no way Biden can return to the nuclear agreement, it could happen. So just to emphasize this point again, I do not believe this will happen. But I'm worried enough that it's something we need to be keeping an eye on.
Okay, one more question. Well, I want to remind our audience, I have a couple of questions in the queue, but please, if you have a question for Ilan or Shaul or both, please type it in the Q&A box. A couple more from me, and then I'll turn to the audience. Ilan, also, yesterday reports surfaced that Secretary Pompeo, Prime Minister Netanyahu, and Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman met in Saudi Arabia. By the way, the reports were that that this was a secret meeting. It wasn't known in advance. The Saudis seem to be denying that it took place. But in any event, during the course of that meeting, MBS, the Crown Prince, declined to normalize relations with Israel. What do you make of this meeting, and where do you see the normalization issue going under Biden, and how does Iran play into this?
Sure. So look, like I think Saudi Arabia, look, we see this sort of quiet, increasing engagement between Israel and Saudi Arabia. I think that is a positive thing, just like I think the Israel-UAE agreement is a positive thing. I think drawing closer ties across the region so you can stabilize the region. The US should always be encouraging this, and there's lots of opportunities for Israel in this. But I think there's a couple of barriers still to Saudi. For one, I think there is a difference between Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince, and King Salman, the father. King Salman is very much of the old guard and the old generation who continues, I think, to believe in the Arab Peace Initiative and no normalization with Israel unless you have like a full agreement with the Palestinians. Now, eventually King Salman will pass from the scene, and at that point, will MBS decide to move forward with normalization? We'll have to wait and see. I mean, the Saudis also face tougher political challenges, right? Like they're the keepers of the two holy mosques in Mecca and Medina. They've also had much more challenging history of dealing with like extremists in their and challengers in their government or in their country, you know, and there's also this kind of ideological competition with Iran, where Iran tries to make play for leadership, at least of the Shia world, where Saudi tries to make play for leadership of the Sunni world. So you have all these things that make it more complicated for the Saudis to do normalization than, let's say, the UAE. Doesn't mean it won't happen, but it is more challenging, you know, and I do think, look, I imagine a Biden administration will continue to support, you know, Arab-Israel normalization and would support certainly Saudi-Israel normalization. But I also think that there's a recognition, at least this is something Tony Blinken said, you know, to, I believe it was Jewish Insider just days before the election in a pretty comprehensive interview. He talked about how, you know, this is good, but like it's not a substitute for the Palestinian issue. It's not a substitute for Israelis and Palestinians making peace. And we also have to focus on that. And I think part of the problem what the Trump administration has done is been entirely ignoring the Palestinians, and where they're not ignoring the Palestinians, sort of trying to squeeze the Palestinians, which has not gotten them very much on that front. But I think a Biden administration will both support Arab state normalization with Israel while also engaging like more credibly with the Palestinians and with the Palestinian leadership.
Thank you. I'm going to turn to audience questions. We have several already. And again, if you want to ask a question, please type it in the Q&A box. So the first question comes from Giorgio Gomel. I think I'm going to ask Shaul to take this on first, and then Ilan, if you want to add. Shaul, can one envisage a situation in which every further opening in relationships between Israel and Arab states is conditional and contingent upon Israeli concessions to Palestinians in peace talks? Shaul, you're on mute. Shaul, you're on mute. Oh, no, we can't hear you.
I said that the only way to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is by direct negotiation with the Palestinians. The Arab world can give the umbrella and the support and to be the moderate in some issues about refugee or even Jerusalem. But I still believe that the only way to resume the negotiation and to have the Palestinian on board is by putting or re-putting the same known parameters that we had in Annapolis. And the Arabs world can help both sides to succeed to achieve the permanent status agreement, and then with the implementation of this agreement.
Thank you. I'll keep going through. We have a bunch of questions. Ilan, I think this is probably for you from Jonah Nagy. Will the Trump administration try to push the Saudis to normalize with Israel before the end of their term? If so, do you think they will succeed? Why or why not?
They might. I don't think they will succeed. I think probably Secretary Pompeo was trying to do it while he was in the region already. I mean, I think they face a number of challenges in doing them. The first is like all the opposition coming from the concerns Saudi Arabia has, which I went through already, which I think are just more complicated than the UAE. And Saudi is a bigger deal than the UAE, much bigger country and more important player. So I think there's that. I also think, that I think Saudi Arabia is in a tough spot going in with the new Biden administration. I mean, really, there's been a deterioration on both sides of the aisles of support for the US-Saudi relationship. It's not just Democrats who are concerned about things like human rights violations in Yemen. It's also Republicans in many cases. Trump administration has been uniquely embracing of the Saudis and have put off a lot of those pressures from Congress, but those pressures are coming back. So in that world, I mean, if the Saudis calculated that, normalization with Israel would help them in the United States, they might save that for a Biden administration. But I'm kind of skeptical on that too. I just don't, even Saudi-Israel normalization, I don't think is going to help the Saudis overcome like the real challenges that they have right now in terms of their standing in Washington. I think that's going to have to be a US-Saudi conversation first and foremost. But, I think that, they'll, if this is something they want to do to sort of get on the better side of the US, they'll save it for Biden, but I don't think this is the play.
Thank you. Okay, I have a question from Bob Goodkind, our vice chair and board member, who asks both of you, how do you expect the new administration to deal with the Trump plan? Do you see it decrying it, renouncing it, or aspects of it, or do you see it ignoring it altogether? Shaul, do you want to take that first?
Yes, I think that the best way is to ignore a Trump vision and to publish a new vision by the new administration, because a Trump vision lays on totally different parameter that we use during Annapolis and the Oslo process. If we are talking about, for instance, a Palestinian capital in East Jerusalem, we know that according to Trump vision, it means to build this capital with only 2 refugee camps, Shu'afat and the Kalandia refugee camp, which is non-starter for the Palestinians. The best way is to publish a new plan for the new administration.
Ilan, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, just that, I mean, I think Shaul's right. Like the best thing to do is ignore and like prepare an alternative. I don't see, I mean, look, I don't speak for them. I don't know what they're going to do, the Biden folks, but like, I don't see them publishing a 100-page plan like the one that like the Trump administration put out. Like that's a huge amount of political capital. They're going to have a lot of other issues they're dealing with, early COVID, economic crisis, other things. People should be realistic about what you might expect from them. But even, just some short articulation of some of the historical sort of parameters that have been largely accepted, whether it's UN Security Council Resolution 242 and 338, whether it's sort of some of the Kerry parameters or the Clinton parameters, or just like some basic statements on things like 1967 with swaps and security, arrangements for both sides and a just and agreed solution to the refugees and 2 capitals in Jerusalem. Even like 3 sentences like that make absolutely clear that and then ignore the Trump plan. They make pretty clear the Trump plan is going away. So whatever it is, I think that's kind of the right approach. I think I very much agree with Shaul.
Thank you. Okay, we've got a question from Sam Bahur in Ramallah. Hi, Sam. He says, excellent session, especially the new map tool. And Shaul, this question is for you. As Bibi continues issuing building permits for new settlements, how much are Israeli citizens aware of the huge risk of moving into these new settlement units? I'm assuming the risk is that a future administration might say they're illegal and they have to be disbanded somehow.
Yeah, first of all, we have to know that last month, the Bibi Netanyahu approved a new housing units, more than 5,000, most of them outside of the blocks, because the idea is to strengthen the isolated settlements and to increase this challenge or this obstacle for implementation of two-state solution. I'm not sure that the Israeli public is aware to this step. Even I published two articles about this plan, and but this step, together with other steps that we faced over the last few years, really could lead us to the situation that the only solution will be one-state solution, which is, as we know, the end of the Zionist vision.
Ilan, anything further or no? Okay.
Yeah,
We've got a question from Nicole Gauet. I hope I pronounced your name correctly, Nicole, from CNN. Beyond Givat Hamatos and Secretary Pompeo's labeling announcement, are there other policy moves you've seen the administration make recently to help Israel before the Biden administration takes over on January 20th? And does the decision to allow Jonathan Pollard to leave the country fit that pattern?
Yeah, you want me to go for that? Sure, Shaul.
Ilan.
Yeah, I mean, Pollard's a big political gift to Bibi. I mean, a huge political gift to Bibi, and something that's been, debated for years in the United States because of sort of, the history there, the concerns from the intelligence community, and it was very tough for previous American presidents to do anything about. So yeah, I would add that very much to the list. I mean, I'm having a hard time at this point thinking of like what else is left other than,
be careful what you wish for.
No, I know. There's like, but I actually do think like, one of the other things that makes me worried is I guess this joint fund between Israel, UAE, and the US, where there's talk of like using some of those funds to start supporting like checkpoints, upgrading checkpoints in the West Bank, which I think is like a deeply problematic thing. I don't think that's very serious right now. I think there was a big announcement and a splash, but I could see the Trump administration trying to like burrow in and do that like under the radar, even into a new administration, kind of get things far along. So I see that as like one of the potential remaining, but I do think the bigger question at this point is probably Iran more than Israel Palestine, like in my opinion. And one other thing I'll say is, Givat Matos, look, that involves signaling, or at least the signal from the US that we have no problem with it, right? So if there's other sensitive settlements that they want to get out there, like now is the time, like get as many tenders out there as possible. And because once the tenders are issued, and look, Shaul knows this much better than I do, but like once they're issued, you can build and you don't have to announce anything. And so a new administration comes in and like they've got this huge pipeline, and then they don't have to announce anything, but they can just keep changing the situation on the ground. So Biden administration is going to have a problem with that. And I think what they might hear from their Israeli counterparts is, well, that's irreversible. And I think that there'll have to be a push to say like, no, that's reversible. You have the power to reverse it. You're the prime minister, like reverse it.
So I want to follow up what Ilan was saying on Givat Matos and the timing for an incoming Biden administration. As I understand it, the tenders were originally, the deadline was January 18th, and then it got moved to January 25th. So that's literally 5 days after the new administration is sworn in. But do you agree with Ilan that it'll be very difficult once these tenders are issued? And by the way, what would the Biden administration even do between January 20th and January 25th to somehow reverse the situation, if it's at all possible?
It's very hard, to stop building the neighborhood of Givat Hamatos when they are starting. I just want to tell you that in 1999, before Ehud Barak was elected, Misha Arens, who was the Israeli Minister of Defense, approved more than 5,000 new housing units. And Barak didn't have the choice, or even the budget to cancel all those tenders. And during his year in office, Israel built more than 5,000 new housing units. I think that we have the same situation now. In February, we will see the new housing units or the starting of building this neighborhood.
So Shaul, bottom line, you're saying this is a fait accompli and there's really, you don't see anything that an incoming Biden administration, with everything it's going to have on its plate, by the way, which is considerable, will be able to stop this. And that would have significant implications going forward, which you laid out so well in the beginning. Okay, I'm going to turn to, let's see, Nancy, where are you? Sorry. Trying to find you. Nancy Bernstein, how can getting back to the JCPOA benefit Saudi Arabia? Ilan, you want to start with that?
Getting back to the JCPOA benefit Saudi Arabia. I do think, well, look, going back to the JCPOA, personally, I believe is a benefit for everyone in the region because it puts Iran's nuclear program back in a box and starts to stabilize the situation. Now, and that could be a benefit to Saudi Arabia in the long term. I don't think the Saudis are going to see it that way, and I don't think Israel will see it that way either, unless there is serious follow-on work and consultation afterwards to not just return to the JCPOA, but build on it. So if you really do, one of the things that's been out there for a long time, and we did a long report on this at CNAS a few months ago on re-engaging Iran, and what does a sort of new diplomacy with Iran look like? It is just really hard to see, you're gonna have this very narrow window between January of 2021 and June of 2021 when there's elections in Iran. And ultimately the supreme leader is the final decision maker in Iran, and he doesn't get elected, but the president and the team around him will change. And the current president, Hassan Rouhani, and his foreign minister, Javad Zarif, look, they're not peaceniks, but they know how to negotiate with the United States. They've negotiated with the folks around Biden before. They're interested in trying to go back to the JCPOA. So you have this very narrow window where you try to go back into the deal. And then once you have a new team in place, you are going to have to build on it. And I think the focus will really need to be on regional discussions. How do we de-escalate in the region? How do we de-escalate in the Persian Gulf, for example? How do we, for example, come to some agreements between Iran and Saudi Arabia on non-interference in each other's affairs? So you stop supporting people who are blowing stuff up in my country, and I stop supporting people who are blowing stuff up in your country. There's a little bit of that going on. How do you, over time, try to end the civil war in Syria or Yemen? You have to be realistic about all these things. This isn't like, hey, we're going to get the Iranian moderates in there and fundamentally change the nature of the Iranian leadership. That's not what this is about. It's about hard-nosed, realistic diplomacy to try to just come up with better options for the region than what we've been doing, which is basically escalating for the last 4 years, which I don't think is ultimately a recipe for stability and doesn't really benefit anybody. So my hope is that a Biden administration can do that effectively, and that, at least at first, Israeli and Saudi and other Gulf colleagues and countries don't have to love everything that's happening, but can give it an opportunity and take their disagreements quietly and talk with the Biden administration about them and try to work out a way forward and see if we can come to the same page, even though there might be some differences, as opposed to ending up in some big political fight like we did in 2015, which I think at the end of the day was bad for the US-Israel relationship. It was kind of bad for everybody across the board.
I think we have time for maybe one or possibly two more questions, depending on how long we go, because we have till the top of the hour. Bob Lifton, our founding chair, asks, isn't the reality at this time that the only leverage that the Palestinians have is to call for a binational state that will frighten Israelis enough to move forward on a negotiation for a two-state solution? Shaul, do you want to start with that?
I'm not sure that I understood the question. Please, if you can repeat.
Okay, I'll try again. Basically, what Bob is asking is the only leverage, the only card, if you will, that the Palestinians have right now to call for a binational state, and somehow by calling for a binational state, somehow that will scare the Israelis enough that they would move forward on negotiating a two-state solution.
Yes. First of all, we have to say that the Palestinian leadership, the current leadership, I'm talking about the PLO, Mahmoud Abbas and others behind him, around him, prefer the two-state solution. But as we know, even Mahmoud Abbas came out 2 years ago in his speech in front of the Assembly of United Nations that he is ready for one-state solution. It's not about binational solution. It's one-state solution, means one man, one vote. And because he really believes that this is the way that the Palestinian can achieve by their majority to establish the Palestinian state on the entire area of the historical Palestine. This is really the real fear that the Israeli have, but we are sure that we are not going to adopt this idea, but to continue with the current situation, what we call the status quo, without annexing area A and area B, and try to develop and to extend the Israeli settlements in the area C, believe that in the end of the day, maybe the Palestinians will give up on their aspiration, national aspiration to establish independent states in the territories.
I think I have time for one more question, but sort of quickly, Ilan, if you would. This is from Susie Becker. Media reports indicate that the Biden administration will try to manage the conflict rather than resolve it. What would it take for the president-elect to launch a new initiative rather than just try to repair some of the damage done by Trump and float things for the next 4 years?
So look, I don't know exactly what they're going to do. I do think that there'll be a lot of early steps to repair the relationship with the Palestinians and start by undoing the damage done by Trump, because you have to do that first before you can move on. Now, personally, I'm opposed to, and we're going to be putting out an extensive report actually next month, CNAS, very much in partnership with IPF, and Michael Koplow is one of our co-writers, on like what we think a new US administration should do. So I'll preview that now. But like one of the things that we found, and we did a pretty extensive task force, is the idea of jumping back into a final status negotiation now is kind of like crazy. Nobody thinks that's a good idea. You don't have anybody on either side. You don't have leaders who are ready to do this. And so that would be a mistake. But just quote unquote conflict management, in other words, just let the conflict stay where it is also not good, because it's going to continue to deteriorate. So the question is, can you do concerted effort to try to improve this situation and reverse some of the negative trends? Can you work on things like Palestinian politics and unity and deterring settlements, and after you undo all the Trump stuff and like giving the Palestinians much more rights and ability in Area C, and building more bridges, non-government bridges between the Israeli and Palestinian society, which are broken down. There's a lot that you can do that's not conflict management, but it's also not like, let's go right back into negotiations right now. And that's kind of what I'd like to see. I'd also just like, Susie, if you don't mind me, just one little thing on Iran, because I've seen it pop up in a couple of places in the Q&A, which is just the difference between just going back into the nuclear deal now or not going back in because of sunsets or things like that. Look, there is no way into a future negotiation with Iran that doesn't involve initial mutual return to the JCPOA. If we do that, we buy ourselves 8 to 10 years. Really serious stuff doesn't start to expire until around 2030. At that point, we will either have a new deal with Iran that further extends the sunset provisions and keeps the nuclear program in a box, or if the negotiations break down, they're not going to be able to just go willy-nilly, because we have the capacity, as the Trump administration has demonstrated, to unilaterally impose sanctions if we want to. And so we still keep that leverage and that ability. So I see our options as return to the deal and then build on it and try to get a better deal, or stay where we are, but then they're just going to keep building nuclear material. They're not coming back to the table, because you need leverage for negotiation, but you also need some like trust. And right now, like we have plenty of leverage with the Iranians, but it doesn't mean anything if they won't sit at the table with us, and they won't. So like this is, I think, a much safer, better option.
Thank you. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have today. So Shaul and Ilan, thank you so much for taking the time. Really, we covered a wide range of areas and topics in just an hour. So thank you both so much. And I also want to thank our supporters who are with us on today's call. Your generosity makes programs like this one possible. Again, if you have not yet done so, please consider making a contribution at www.israelpolicyforum.org/giving. please consider doing so on this Giving Tuesday. Thank you all for joining us today. I want to encourage you to subscribe to our podcast, Israel Policy Pod, sign up to receive the weekly Capital column in your inbox, and visit our website to access recordings of our previous briefings. I also invite you to check out Shaul's study, Understanding the Trump Plan, published earlier this year, which is available on our homepage. Please stay tuned for an announcement about our next video briefing, which will take place next Tuesday, December 1st at 2 p.m. Eastern, 11 a.m. Pacific. Remember, if it's Tuesday, it's an IPF webinar. Until then, stay safe, stay healthy, and happy Thanksgiving. We'll see you again soon. Thank you so much. Have a good day.